Hello and welcome to the Girls Fuel podcast. My name is Haley. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition coach here to help you along your health and fitness journey by providing evidence and experience-based knowledge and, as always, full transparency. Today's episode is going to be a really fun one. This topic is something that I feel like a lot of people struggle with without even knowing that they struggle with it. So Jess and I are going to dive into histamine intolerances, signs and symptoms that you might have one, and what to do about it. And Jess, you've dealt with these before and recently too, right?
Yeah, I was just telling Haley that now that I know more about histamines, I notice other people and their histamine issues and even notice some myself too. And you think it's like, oh, it's just seasonal allergies, and you have no idea the relationship with histamine. So I'm excited for you to break it down.
Definitely. So, big things that come to mind with histamines are we'll ask our clients, do you struggle with what feels like chronic seasonal allergies, whether it is truly seasonal or if you feel like you need to pop a Zyrtec or Claritin all year round in order to stay out of that foggy, stuffy, sniffly, itchy array of symptoms. And that was my main symptom for a really long time,
Hmm.
where I just relied on those over-the-counter medications and was always foggy. We have histamine receptors all over our
Hmm.
body, which we're going to get to. So other histamine symptoms might be painful periods, heavy periods. Histamines are also present in the EC cells of our GI tract because they help release HCl. So if we have a histamine overload, histamine excess, we might also see bloating, acid reflux, and increased motility, so diarrhea. Coming back to that acid reflux, histamines are a main reason why people end up on chronic medications like proton pump inhibitors. So, like Nexium is one of them. There are a bunch of different acid blocking medications. And one of the main root causes is that histamine production in the gut. So, let's dive into what histamines are and what they do. Jess, do you want to take off with that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so histamines are chemicals your body produces as part of your immune system response, and they're responsible for helping to defend against allergens, foreign invaders, and things like that. And when your body detects something harmful, like pollen, dust, or mold, so I can talk a little bit more about my experience with mold after, but histamines are released to increase blood flow to the affected area. So then that's what causes symptoms like inflammation, itching, and those symptoms basically help to eliminate this.
Definitely. And like I started mentioning earlier, we have histamine receptors all over our bodies. And this is where identifying the root problem often comes down to identifying where the histamine issue is primarily. And now a lot of us will have multiple issues. We can think about having the four different types of histamine receptors. The first one is what we call H1. And this one is primarily related to our gut brain axis, as with people who have symptoms in that H1 receptor being an overload. So that what that'll mean is histamines bind to their designated receptors. That's how they work. And we need histamines, right? They're very helpful for our body's immune response. But when we have an excess and our body isn't able to properly break them down, we see that overload. So with H1, we will often see a lot of skin symptoms like hives, we'll see allergies, we'll see issues with the sleep wake cycle. And that's where, if somebody has like an insomnia issue, that can also be a histamine issue. And this, for me, if you've been following along, I had chronic insomnia for almost, I think, 6 to 8 years. And eventually I realized that my whole body was just like overcome with histamine overload. And that's where for years I would take like a Benadryl or a Z-Quil or probably a lot more than just that. And why that helps is because it blocks the histamines from binding to the receptor, and it'll help make you drowsy, where those histamines are more active in keeping you awake. Histamines are also going to be present in the skin. Some people with a mold overgrowth may experience increased rashes or hives in reaction to the sun, because mold, it lives all within us, and mold is one of the primary drivers of a histamine intolerance or histamine overdrive, so to speak. If we have mold spores in our skin lining, we might be more sensitive to the sun. Histamines also, like I kind of mentioned, modulate our internal clock. So sleep wake cycle, think sun in the morning, dark at night, and help with the release of melatonin. So if you're having excess amounts of histamine, that's where we might see issues with that sleep wake cycle. Primarily, we'll see fatigue. And I know, Jess, you're noticing that with your mold now, that the fatigue is there. You might not feel as awake in the morning or maybe struggling with
Mhm.
sleep at night. So one question I'll often ask my clients if they're exhibiting a lot of histamine symptoms is, do over-the-counter allergy meds like Benadryl, like Claritin or Zyrtec, Allegra, do they actually help? In some cases, they won't work at all if the histamine overload is that severe, because the receptor is just so blocked up that there's nothing that those medications can do. Then we have our H2 receptors. These are in the lining of the GI tract and help with that release of HCLs. If our enzymes that break down histamine, one of them is DAO enzyme, if that one is low. So one of the big things to note with GI symptoms is just noticing that they might be multi kind of factual, where we'll have a fluctuation between constipation and diarrhea for some people. Some of our histamine girlies will be straight up diarrhea all the time. We'll often see that acid reflux. And when we're thinking about what is driving this, why is this happening? There are a lot of different infections or chronic immune states that can cause this histamine overload. One of them we mentioned is mold, but there's also a lot of histamine producing bacteria species in our GI tract that when they're overgrown, which we could see that on a GI map, we are going to see that exacerbation of GI symptoms. Candida is going to be another one. And we'll dive into in a few minutes what you can do if you think you might be experiencing histamine symptoms from one of these different receptor issues or all four. H3 is more related to our neurotransmitters. So kind of similar to that H1, where H1 is a little bit more skin related as well. Our histamines also impact our mental health. And this is why I think we see so much of an increase in mental health disorders nowadays. I see it on Instagram all the time where people are talking about increases in autoimmune conditions, increases in mental health disorders. And a lot of it is, in my opinion, related to poor gut health, right? With the H3 histamine overload on that receptor, we may have exacerbation of premenstrual symptoms, right? Because other considerations for histamines are our sex hormones, right? Estrogen is very promoting of histamines. So if we have estrogen dominance, if we have an high amount of estrogen or high amounts related to progesterone, we are going to see an exacerbation of those mood related symptoms around our period, as well as heavier cramping. Histamines also stimulate GABA, which is an anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. We can get it from early morning sun. So that's where we often will recommend our clients start their day with sun exposure, and their day making sure that the rooms of their house are nice and dark, or they're wearing blue light glasses. But GABA doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So if we're having a histamine issue related to neurotransmitters and brain health, we might have what we consider leaky brain. And that's where your brain might be having an issue absorbing and utilizing things like the GABA and the L-theanine and things like that to properly regulate your brain's ability to calm itself, right? So when we have excess histamines in the brain, and we can also talk about mast cells or MCAS, these things can all often cause overactivity and more of a stress-driven response in the brain. So again, hopefully what you get from this receptor talk, if nothing more, is that histamines impact all different systems in our body. And the last one that I'll talk about is H4, which is more related to our lungs, because we have histamine receptors in our lung tissue. So with this type of histamine overload, we might see hives, we might see asthma, chronic chest infections. One of my long-term clients, and this woman never got sick, knock on wood. Like, I've known this woman for like 10 years because we worked together in person, but she got pneumonia like 3 times in the span of 6 months, and both lungs were impacted. And she also had chronic seasonal allergies that didn't seem too bad. But I was like, hey, will you humor me and get a mold test done? Like, this is not normal for you to have pneumonia this many times. Like, you're usually so healthy, so active, so strong. And we got the test done, and she did have very high levels of mold. So, a lot of times when we see that lung involvement, and this is why a lot of our clients that come to us with the typical, what we consider the histamine triad, so anxiety, allergies, and asthma, or just trouble with breathing, shortness of breath, coughing, that's where we automatically assume, hey, there's something with histamines going on. We need to dive deeper to figure out why. And then I mentioned this, but another big histamine symptom is going to be itching or skin rashes. So I already mentioned briefly how the estrogen and progesterone, where estrogen is more stimulatory of histamines and progesterone is more calming of them. With somebody that does have more estrogen dominance, likely also sluggish liver detox, so we're not properly excreting estrogen as well as the histamine breakdown, we may notice more itching or more rashes or hive-like reactions around our cycle while estrogen is increasing. And then that should all calm down once we get our cycle and estrogen is getting lower. Some other symptoms, we might see high eosinophils in your lab work. Eosinophil activation syndrome is very, very strongly correlated with excess histamine and mast cells. We might see joint pain or a reduced pain tolerance in joints, ligaments, tendons, poor muscle recovery due to the level of inflammation that the histamine response or mast cell response are causing. And sensitivity to supplements, smells, touch, chemicals. That was one for me. I'm curious if you have this, Jess. I am so sensitive to stuff like that. Like the other day, oh my God, I laughed so hard. I was like lifting at the like corner of the gym, and they have a hallway that leads to like a pole dancing studio, and they had candles lit in the hallway, and I was literally getting so annoyed. I was like, I'm trying to lift and there's candle and it smells fine, but it's just so overstimulating to my senses. I ran down the hallway and I blew it out. It was like, fuck you guys, I
Mm.
can't deal with your candle. Nobody noticed, but that could be like that hypersensitivity related to the histamines in your body. And Jess, do you have any questions that the listener might be thinking of based on that? I feel like I just dumped a lot on you guys.
Okay, when you say sensitive to substances, do you mean like just sensitive, like it really bothers you, or sensitive, like for your literally physically sensitive for like your eyes?
It can go one, I've seen it go both ways, right? And I'm sure, coaches listening to this, you've probably had clients where you add a supplement and they react so poorly. Like maybe they get hives, maybe they get diarrhea, maybe they
Yep.
get really
Yep.
nauseous. So that can be a sign of some sort of histamine overload. And again, we always want to know why, because, well, yes, the environment is going to play a big role in our histamine symptoms, like different allergens and things that are floating around, but that's for most people not enough to cause an overload, right?
Yep. Yep.
Usually it's related to
Yeah.
something internally. With other clients, I've had them say that they can't wear certain perfumes or certain jewelries anymore because it'll cause a redness on their
Yeah.
skin. I've had
Rash.
that happen before as well.
Me too. Me
Yeah,
too. Especially with not real. Like I can't wear any fake jewelry. It
I
will
can't either.
completely mess me up. Like it needs to be real jewelry.
And that could be related to, obviously, we know Jess has mold. So we found
Yeah.
out recently that there is a lot of mold inside of Jess. So that is why, you have most of your histamine symptoms. And mold is a big driver. Another one is, again, that intestinal dysbiosis that we talked about, where we might see that overgrowth of candida, histamine producing bacteria, but a lot of it will often stem back to something like mold. Another common cause of histamine overload is leaky gut. So if somebody has very weakened, damaged mucosal linings, especially gut and skin, that just allows things to seep through. So that's where we might see like a delayed onset of allergies, where things are being broken down. And when they reach the lining, even histamines, there's an immune response to it. And that's why some people might develop food intolerant symptoms or even like dermatitis, psoriasis. Those can also be driven by histamines. And a lot of times the immune states kind of overlap with each other. So now that we've kind of talked about what histamines are, what overload might look like, a big thing to think about is, why is this happening, right? And I'm curious if you're listening to this and if you've started like taking notes of the things I was saying. I'm curious how many of the symptoms that you might be experiencing. And again, we're coming out with a symptom quiz. So if it might be out by the time this podcast is out, where we'll be able to help you figure out the root cause of those symptoms. But histamines are a big possibility. But the big reason why we see histamines overloaded is because they're supposed to be broken down by enzymes. The main one is DAO, diamine oxidase in the gut, and HNMT. I'm not going to try to pronounce, actually, I can try. Histamine L N methyl, that was pretty good, in other tissues.
That's
So,
good.
yeah, a lot of times we'll see the downregulation of these enzymes, and that's where we're not able to break down histamines. So, when the process of breakdown is impaired, histamines can cause exacerbated immune response and the symptoms that we previously talked about. So, as far as what we can do, Jess, I would love for you to talk through some things that we can do if we suspect a histamine overload.
Yeah, actually, like from what you were just talking about, I was just going to ask you, okay, when should you, because obviously there are foods with histamines in them. And so one of my questions was, okay, when do you start experimenting? Like, how bad do you wait for it to get till you start experimenting with, say, for example, a low histamine diet, or experimenting with potential supplements and things like that?
That's a great question. So, the low histamine diet can be very helpful. Typically, when I will implement this will depend on the client, right? If we have somebody that's coming to us and they can barely focus on eating 3 meals a day, I'm not going to have them avoid foods. However, just like you and I would normally do, we often will start with just picking a few things and customizing the elimination. So, for those of you that are listening and want to know what is a low histamine diet, it definitely can seem overwhelming at first. But, like just mentioned, there are a lot of foods that can produce histamines or exacerbate histamine production or inhibit breakdown in our body. Some of the top offenders are going to be like gluten, some dairy, mainly like aged or fermented things, specifically like certain cheeses. Alcohol is going to be a hard no. So that's where with a lot of our clients we'll start with, hey, can we do absolutely no gluten, no alcohol, and limit dairy? Because again, if the high histamine list is pretty long, like there are certain fruits that are higher in histamine, think like citrus fruits, dried fruits, even certain vegetables like
Mm-hmm.
eggplant comes to mind, even things like soy and legumes and
Mm-hmm.
peanuts and vinegar, like pickled things, tomatoes. What I've personally found in practice from having taken so many people through like elimination style diets is it has to be customized to the individual because everybody has a varied response to histamines in our diet. The biggest thing is going to be making it sustainable for the period of time that you're doing it. Because a lot of times, again, the cause of the histamine overload is an infection. And getting rid of an infection is going to take a good 8 to 12 weeks. So I want to make sure, are you going to be able to do this elimination for at least like 30 days? Because that's typically where we'll start. Hey, let's take these out for a month. And while we really work on your insides, we add some supplementation, we support liver
Mm-hmm.
detox, we add some enzyme support. So that way, gradually, your body's able to break things down better and better. But that's where we'll look at your diet kind of person to person and eliminate what we need to. But big ones right off the bat are usually going to be alcohol, gluten, aged or fermented dairy. We'll also often avoid like curd meat or deli meat just because I feel like those aren't really that great for you anyway. Fermented foods I mentioned. Coffee is technically high in histamine, but this one I will really only remove in very severe cases because I feel you. I love my coffee. When I was dealing with histamine issues, this is the one thing that I never removed. And I definitely still had symptoms to it. In the past, I used to drink coffee and like immediately sneeze 100 times. Now, thankfully, that does not happen. But tomato product is another big one, especially if you have
Yeah.
acid reflux. It's a lot easier to tell which foods you need to pull out and which you don't. But if the person is, I will do whatever it takes, I will do low histamine for at least 2 weeks. If that dietary change makes a significant difference, we will keep as much of it as we can throughout the rest of our protocol while addressing other variables like stress management, right? Like hormone imbalances, which a lot of times hormones, and you'll hear us talk about this, these kind of just go hand in hand with healing the gut. You'll almost never see us put a client through a hormone protocol before a gut protocol if they need it, right? Just because a lot of times when we clear out whatever's going on in the GI tract, or if it's like a mold systemic, that allows neurotransmitters to cross more effectively. That allows hormone
Mm-hmm.
levels to be excreted and detoxified more effectively. So a lot of times we're always going to focus on that GI tract, but that's a great question about the histamines. Did that kind of answer it?
Yeah, definitely. And my other question was very interesting because I don't have the classic histamine. Everyone thinks of allergy symptoms.
Yep.
So, for example, I don't have classic histamine symptoms. Like, I have a lot of brain fog. That's like my biggest. Like, I have a lot of neurological symptoms. So I feel like you need to connect the dots there with, okay, just because you don't have allergy symptoms doesn't mean you're not having a histamine intolerance. And yeah, can you talk a little bit about the variability in symptoms and how they can be different from each person?
100%. And I would say histamines are one of those that it is very different. Unlike if somebody has SIBO, we're going to see a couple different like types of symptoms. We're either going to
Yeah,
see someone that's really like diarrhea, gassy, yucky, or we're going to see constipated, distension, all of that. But histamines overload is going to look very different for different people, but also the severity of it, right? Because
yes,
you can
of
have
course,
a
yeah,
low grade histamine overload where maybe you're just not breaking them down as quickly as you need to be. So that's
yeah,
where, as a coach, you're really going to need to be able to do that intake of your client and also look at their history. So this is where we have a lot of questions sprinkled into our onboarding questionnaire
yeah,
that gives us clues about other possible histamine symptoms and how deep rooted they are. The main reason we have the question of, do you have any allergies to medications, is because a lot of times we'll see allergies to medications that are derived from a mold or a fungi. So, like a penicillin, for example, or amoxicillin, they're
mm-hmm.
derived from mold. And what that shows us is that they likely have a mold overgrowth, right? And mold is going to be the biggest driver. But if I have clients that their primary symptoms are more mental, like yours, which I definitely have that, where bowel movements are pretty normal, but we're having
Yeah,
insomnia, we're having fatigue, we're having anxiety, maybe we're having headaches and migraines. I won't do I won't do anywhere near the same protocol. We still need a lot of the same compounds in there to support the breakdown and degradation of histamine, to support GI lining, to support liver detoxification. But it is going to vary very person to person. So that's where we can go back to those receptors that I mentioned, the H1 through
yeah,
H4. And that's where, as practitioners, we need to be able to identify, all right, where is the histamine intolerance coming from? Because there are different issues and different places that they can occur. And it's also evaluating other variables of your client's health, from what is stress like? How are they managing that? What is their day to day?
mm-hmm.
How much sleep are they getting? Do they have the dysbiosis or candida symptoms? Does it seem more neurological or impacting their limbic system? So it really is understanding which system is impacted. But
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, we need to get rid of the histamines. We need to reduce them by getting to
Yeah,
the root cause. So no matter what the histamine symptoms are, the root cause matters more. So this is a big place where I see people going wrong, is they're going to take 6 supplements that are like histamine digest, Hista-X, which is a probiotic that we like, DAO enzyme, even I can think of a couple others like a liver thing, and that's all great. But if we're not getting to the root of why you have these high histamine symptoms, then that doesn't matter. You're going to need to spend $200 on all those supplements every month for the rest of your life. Treating the root cause, be that a SIBO, be that a high estrogen and estrogen dominance, be that a candida, a mold, for example, we're going to need
yeah,
to work on those things first, but then also add
mm-hmm.
support for those other things. So if somebody's mainly having migraines and hormonal symptoms, we're going to heavily support liver detoxification, the milk thistle, the NAC, the TUDCA. If they're not having diarrhea, we might add some DIM to help get some of that estrogen out. We may
Mm-hmm.
add supplemental DAO enzyme, which I don't always do for my histamine girls. I've taken DAO enzyme many times and it is very helpful, but it is also expensive. But again, if the histamine symptoms seem like they're mainly gut dominant, we know that H2 receptor is in the GI lining. So we likely see that leaky gut there. So that's where we need to
Mm-hmm.
investigate what is breaking down the lining and how can we repair it. And that is also, if we see it in the gut, where I will go low histamine. and also add some immune system support because histamines are going to be very aggressive with the immune system. So we'll want to add some IgG, IgA support, as well as different vitamins and minerals to help with the production of DAO in itself.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah. And I think too, you were talking about supplements that are help with histamine intolerances. But I also think there's something to be said for taking random probiotics and digestive enzymes and random supplements that maybe don't have to do with histamine intolerance, but they can exacerbate symptoms if you are taking a bunch of random supplements that you're not sure that are exacerbating your symptoms. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, 100%. It's just a matter of minimum effective dose when it comes to histamines and just in general. Like we always
Yeah.
prioritize a minimum effective dose when it comes to recommending supplements because, yes,
Yeah.
you might check all the boxes for having a hormone related histamine overload. You might check the box for the gut as well as the CNS, as well as the skin and the sinus tract, but we're not going to throw that would literally be like 30 supplements if we wanted to target each one. So when it comes to breaking down histamines, it always is going to come back from the gut to the gut. We need that DAO enzyme and we need stomach secretions to be produced. So that's where we'll
Yeah.
support stomach acid levels, we'll support enzyme levels, and it also requires a lot of different vitamins and minerals. So specifically iron, B12, B6, magnesium, vitamin C, and copper. So copper is another big one where we'll see copper is deficient with people that have histamine issues. So making sure vitamin and mineral status is supported is always going to be an order of business number one. Another thing to think about is mitochondrial health. A big reason why we might have trouble breaking down histamines is if we're not actively able to detoxify and express our mitochondrial health and produce ATP for energy in our different organ systems. And then also the liver, that HNMT that I mentioned is closely related to methylation. So if we are not properly methylating, we are going to have that backup of histamine symptoms. We are going to have that high allergy response, maybe skin issues, again, more of those chronic issues because we get stuck in that immune state. So that's where being aware of where the issue is likely coming from is going to be helpful. And what our approach is from the get-go is supporting those kind of basic pillars of GI lining, enzyme production, absorption of food, which is going to go hand in hand with those two things, and vitamin and mineral status. From there, it really will depend. There are supplements and compounds that can help for that more Th2, Th9 immune response, but a lot of that will depend on symptoms as well.
Awesome. That was
Yeah.
super thorough.
So if you're someone that has or thinks that you have a histamine overload, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. And we can talk about this more, but kind of right off the get-go, things that I would consider doing. Biggest thing is going to be optimizing gut health. So be careful what probiotics you're using. There are certain bacteria strains that can promote increased histamine production. I would really focus on restoring stomach acid levels. So taking some gentle enzymes, maybe doing an apple cider vinegar or a digestive bitter, depending on what you can tolerate. Reducing histamines from your diet could be really helpful. And it would be something that I'd say to try for about 2 weeks and see if you notice a difference, starting with gluten, alcohol, fermented foods, processed meats, and things of that nature. If you were to Google low histamine diet, you would see not to eat leftovers because technically once you cook something like a meat, for example, and you leave it in the fridge, it is going to produce more histamine. I honestly don't usually make people follow that one unless they notice a symptom. I have had clients typically in the earlier days of their mold overgrowth where they literally notice the histamine symptoms increase after eating something that's been in the fridge. But usually I'm not a big stickler on that one just because I don't think it's realistic to cook a fresh meal, like cook all of your meals fresh every day. Well, tomatoes, go easy on the citrus, limit processed foods. I know when I was dealing with my really bad histamine symptoms, I love ketchup. If you watch me eat like we do burger bowls all the time, I use a disgusting amount of ketchup. I love it so much, but I literally had to avoid it when Jess is dying. I had to avoid it when I was dealing with my histamine issues, and mine were mainly due to candida and like overgrowth of bad bacteria because I would eat it. And you can ask Ed, there were nights I had to take Benadryl. Like I just risked it for the biscuit. And I would get so flush and itchy. Like I just had to like take something. But that was an extreme response. Sneezing is another common one, or just the typical allergy symptoms, sinus congestion, headaches, migraines, hormones, all of that. And then I'd also really emphasize supporting liver detoxification and production of DAO enzymes. So again, I mentioned vitamins and minerals that are specific for DAO, but there are also foods like pea shoots are one that come to mind for DAO. And then foods that support liver detoxification are also going to be rich in B vitamins. So sulfur containing vegetables, colorful fruits and veggies that contain antioxidants, bitter greens. We also talk about for liver health. So things like bok choy and arugula
Mm,
that come to mind right off the bat. Fennel is another one. You can like blend it in smoothies because it doesn't taste like much
mm,
to help with liver detoxification, as well as making sure that you're getting the B vitamin support that you need to help with methylation. Managing stress. Big thing here with exercise and histamine is going to be not doing HIIT exercise and not fasting. If we are fasting, that is just throwing off our circadian rhythm as well as our enzyme production and our digestive process even more. So, rule of thumb, fast 10 to 12 hours overnight, but especially if we're dealing with some histamine issues, we don't really want to do much more than that. But making sure we're managing our stress, we're not overdoing training because stress, chronic stress, can exacerbate those histamine symptoms. And then if we're thinking leaky gut, zinc carnosine is a great place to start for GI lining support. And then from there, I love that throat coat tea. I talk about that all the time. But if you're someone that feels like you live in a never ending cycle of seasonal allergies, you wake up stuffy, dry eyes, skin is irritated, brain fog, anxiety, PMS, asthma, all these things, like you don't have to accept them as your normal, right? I have so many clients that come to me where they're like, oh, yeah, like I just use this inhaler all the time. Or if I use this corticosteroid cream all the time, my rashes are fine or my eczema is fine. I'm like, yeah, but do you want to be using that cream for
mm,
the rest of your life? Or do you want to be paying to have an inhaler forever or being afraid to go out in the fall and pick pumpkins because you're going to die of hay and all that, whatever's out there? Like, the good news is it doesn't have to be your normal. We just need to figure out where the histamine issue is coming from, what the root cause is, and how we can fix it before it wreaks havoc on all of your systems. Cool beans. Do you think that covers everything?
yeah, I think that I like the ending on that in terms of what someone can do if they do resonate with this.
Yes. Awesome. All right, guys. So if you are listening to this, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. Share this with a friend who might need it. I know most of our friends have sniffly noses and
Yeah.
chronic seasonal allergies. So there's definitely someone you can share it with. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out on Instagram. Our inboxes are always open. And again, thank you so much for hanging out with us.